The Honourable Adam Searle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I rise to speak this evening about the recent rail chaos seen in Sydney. That disputation and the resulting chaos for commuters was brought about by the gross incompetence of this government and its Transport Minister. Now, given both the Premier and her Minister are former Ministers for Industrial Relations, the mishandling of the issue was both extraordinary and worrying. There has not been a rail strike in New South Wales for decades, certainly not one this century. The main union, the Rail, Tram and Bus Union, has a long history of responsible industrial relations under governments of different political complexions. So how did the Premier and her Minister fail to competently resolve this matter before it reached the position that it did? Failures in workforce planning and management lie at the heart of the issue. The reliance by the New South Wales Government on train drivers and signallers performing overtime for the provision of basic rail services is dangerous because of the potential risks to public safety posed by a fatigued workforce. With there being around 150 train drivers too few under the current timetable, there is clearly a need for the government to employ more train drivers, but it has failed to do so. Is it because the cost of employing more train drivers and signallers is an extra net cost on the forward estimates, whereas, although a recurrent cost, the payment of overtime payments does not turn up on the forward estimates in quite the same way? The proposed strike was also brought about by the stalemate in industrial negotiations over a new work deal. While the coalition government has been quick to denounce the union and its members for proposing to strike, they conveniently overlooked the fact that both New South Wales and federal government industrial relations policies forced the union and its members to take this step if they wished to progress their negotiations with management. This is because in the federal industrial system, which covers the New South Wales rail industry, if workers cannot reach a negotiated agreement with their employer, their only choices are to give up and take whatever management offers, or to try and take protected industrial action. The position in New South Wales was reached because rail management had limited authority to reach an agreement, and the government itself refused to negotiate with the union. The cancellation of the proposed industrial action by the Fair Work Commission has also raised the question of how working people can improve their pay and conditions when their employer refuses to reach an agreement with them. The advice given by Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe last year, that workers should just ask their employer for a raise, is clearly not enough and is not working. In Australia, the ability for working men and women to strike has historically been restricted on the basis that there was, at both state and federal level, a more civilised way to resolve industrial disputes, through arbitration by an independent umpire. This approach served our country well for over a century, helping to ensure that working people had decent incomes and were able to support their families. This unique approach to resolving workplace disputes and the resulting benefits for working people has resulted in many positive social and economic outcomes for our country. Industrial arbitration is a key reason for Australia's high historic levels of home ownership, for example. Now, since work choices, arbitration of wage claims has now effectively been abolished. The result is the historic low wage growth now being experienced in Australia. The wage price index, the most reliable indicator of labour costs, is at a record low. The profit share of national income is soaring, while the share going to the workforce is equal to the lowest level since the Second World War. Outside a handful of industries, most workers in Australia are not really in a position to take lawful industrial action, whether it's due to a lack of bargaining power, being casual or otherwise vulnerable, or not being organised. And largely they do not do so. Where they do take industrial action, they lose pay and potentially put their own jobs at risk. Given these consequences, workers and unions usually don't go down this path only as a last resort. As a result of Fair Work Commission cancelling the industrial action, it now seems industrial action will not be allowed if the impact is to be too great on the community. There is a clear double standard then in the system. Where agreement can't be reached, workers are told you have to take industrial action, but if your industrial action is going to be too inconvenient for the general community, it should not be permitted. This appears to be...
only postponed.
Well, so far. But this is grossly unfair and it leaves working people with no avenue to improve their pay and conditions. The balance needs to be restored. The answer is to allow industrial arbitration again, at least where industrial action is not to be permitted.